landmines and cluster munitions, they continue to kill and maim civilians, roughly half of which are children, every single year. In this panel, survivors, advocates, and policy experts will speak about the human consequences of using these weapons and discuss U.S. landmine and cluster munition policy and provide recommendations for how the U.S. government can address these better going forward. With that, I'm really glad to welcome Lee Po Cha, who will be our first speaker. He has an MBA and became the IRCO's executive director in April 2015. He has served with the IRCO since 1981 in a multitude of leadership roles, most recently associate director and director of Pacific Islander and Asian Family Center, which he helped found in 1994. A former refugee from Laos, Lee came to Oregon in 1978 and studied at Marylhurst University. As a Hmong American, he embodies the vision of the IRCO as an organization committed to helping each immigrant and refugee family achieve their full potential in their new home. And with that, I'll pass it over to Lee.
Good morning, all. Indeed, I'm from the West Coast, so still morning for me. So again, good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to be with you, and thank you to the USCBL and CMC for the invitation to share my story. My father and other family members were recruited by the US to serve during the secret war in Laos from 1964 to 1973. I remember those days and nights that my parents took me into the bunker for safety. All the gun fires and loud explosions were tremendously frightening for a young, innocent child. What's more traumatic is witnessing funeral ceremony and burial for my family members who have been killed by landmines and bombing, and seeing individuals who suffer permanent handicap for those weapons, from those weapons. In 1975, my family fled Laos on foot. It took us nearly 3 weeks to cross the border into Thailand. During this journey, I experienced the death of family members being killed along the way. In one particular event, I witnessed my father and my uncle bury someone. At the time, my father told me when I asked, what happened and what are they doing? That they were simply just digging to plant a banana tree. Despite his story, I knew something bad had happened. Not until later in that journey did I learn that it was my cousin who they had buried. At the moment, I understood why my aunt and uncle has been crying during the journey. Also, unfortunately, a landmine claimed the life of my brother-in-law while he tried to cross the border from Laos into Thailand. In another incident, because of fears of capture, my sister provided her daughter with opiums to prevent her from crying and attracting attention. Unfortunately, she gave her daughter too much, and her young daughter died. My family has been in the refugee camp in Thailand for nearly 3 years. We finally resettled in the US later in 1978. Even though this experience are 50 years in the past, they are still so painful for my family. I sometimes reflect on my childhood days and think, this is not my war. So why do I have to suffer from it? I feel fortunate to have been able to resettle in the state of Oregon as a young man. I'd had the opportunity to become educated in the Western educational system. This experience had shaped my compassion and humanitarian response regarding the issue faced by immigrants and refugees. In my early college day, I discovered the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization, IRCO, IRCO, and entered IRCO as a summer youth program counselor. I found IRCO's missions and a mission to be unique and compelling. As a result, I stayed with IRCO for the last 43 years. As executive director of IRCO, I enjoy working with refugees from all parts of the globe. Working at IRCO, I have seen people from all corners of the world seeking safety and freedom, many of whom has traumatic experience like my own, and I can relate to them all. As a refugee, the only thing we have left is our hopes and dreams. IRCO and IRCO's mission have helped many to realize their hopes and dreams and help bring those hopes and dreams to reality. As a result, they have been able to build a new life and truly taste what freedom is all about. At IRCO, we have over 620 regular employees, and we speak over 98 different languages daily. We serve more than 30,000 individuals annually. There's no doubt in my mind, indiscriminate weapons like cluster munition should have no place in this world if we want to prioritize human life. Laos is one of the most bombed countries per capita in human history and is heavily contaminated by cluster munition. Over the last decade, a report has shown 322 injured and 94 deaths occurred during UXO accidents in Laos, the overwhelming amount from cluster munition. Nearly 50% of these accidents were children under the age of 18. So far this year, 2024, there have been 40 reported civilian casualties from UXO accidents. There's a growing number of survivors, with over half of all accidents involving children under the age of 18 require aid that is not being met by current U.S. funding. More than 1,177 UXO survivors have received support, but thousands more still waiting. In close, I would like to take this opportunity to appreciate the United States for being the biggest funder of global demining, with over 360 million allocated to demining activities in Lao PDR since 1995. However, please also remember that US spent at least 50 billion to bomb Lao PDR from 1964 to 1973. And if all development countries deserve a healthy environment, then so do the country of Laos and its people. Thanks again, and it's such a humble opportunity, and thank you for having me and joining this group. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us this morning, Lee. I know it's not always an easy thing to discuss, especially in what I assume is about 8 in the morning for you on the West Coast. But I think it's an important perspective to begin this discussion with.
At least I'm a coffee, so thank you.
And unfortunately, we have had some connection issues with our colleague in West Virginia. And so I'm going to break up the order a little than originally was planned and go to our colleague, Mary Warham. She is the Deputy Director of Crisis, Conflict, and Arms Division at Human Rights Watch, where she manages the division's arms program. Mary coordinated the Stop Killer Robots campaign from its inception in 2012 until March of 2021. She contributed to the adoption of the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions and assisted Jody Williams in coordinating the international campaign to ban landmines, and is a co-laureate of the 1997 Nobel Peace Prize, together with Williams, for establishing and coordinating. She now, has established and coordinated the Landmine Monitor Research Initiative to verify the implementation of the 1997 mine ban treaty. So with that, Mary, I'd like to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Ursula, and hi, everybody. It's good to see some friendly faces and some new ones on this call. Yes, so Mary Wareham from Human Rights Watch, and I was down to talk about cluster munitions, and I will do that. Maybe I'll just say a couple of words about landmines, which was Larry's topic to start with. And the whole kind of framing for this event is to talk about the US role on both landmines and on cluster munitions. Both these weapons have similar impacts on civilians, but they are explicitly prohibited by different international treaties. So the Mine Ban Treaty is the treaty that prohibits anti-personnel landmines of 164 countries on board. The United States has not joined the Mine Ban Treaty. The policy on landmines for the United States dates from June 2022, and that's when President Biden aligned U.S. policy with most of the provisions of the Landmine Treaty to come into alignment with it and set the goal for the United States to join the Mine Ban Treaty. The big sticking point on landmines for the United States is the Korean Peninsula and the need to apparently use anti-personnel landmines in the event of an invasion from the north to the south. And so this is where the United States needs to figure out what it's going to do there. But the US was the first country to call for the eventual elimination of anti-personnel landmines. And I'm looking at that date. It said that in 1994, 30 years ago. And here we are. The story of the United States on cluster munitions is quite a different one. We heard from Lee about how the United States has used cluster munitions in the past in Southeast Asia. And the United States policy at the moment is that it cannot join the convention because cluster munitions provide, quote, a vital military capability. The United States has used cluster munitions in several armed conflicts around the world, but that statement about the vital military capability is an interesting one because the last time the United States used cluster munitions in any great numbers was during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. So more than 20 years ago, there was a single attack in Yemen in 2009 in December. But overall, the United States is not using cluster munitions. It is not producing cluster munitions. The last budgeted funds for that was in 2007, and the last manufacturer of cluster munitions in the United States, Textron, shut down that product line in 2016. However, the United States has produced millions of cluster munitions in the past, and it has a vast stockpile of cluster munitions, and that's what's been in the news lately. We didn't detect any major transfers of cluster munitions by the United States since the treaty banning these weapons came into effect in 2008. But last July, a year ago, the Biden administration approved the transfer of some of the stocks of U.S. cluster munitions to Ukraine for use in the war against Russia. Cluster munitions have been used in Ukraine since the very first day of the war. And your comment, Lee, recalled the comment by the U.S. ambassador to the Security Council, Linda Thomas Greenfield, in March of 2022, when the invasion was very fresh, where she criticized Russia's use of cluster munitions, calling them unacceptable weapons that have no place on the battlefield. That was scrubbed from the transcript. They realized that that was not the U.S. position. The U.S. talks about military utility. But my organization, Human Rights Watch, and in the Cluster Munition Coalition, which we co-founded back in 2003, we approach this from a humanitarian perspective. And unfortunately, there has been hundreds of civilian victims from Russia's cluster munition attacks in Ukraine since the very first day of the invasion in February 2022. The cluster munition remnants are leaving behind submunitions that are posing a threat in a similar way to landmines. and creating a contamination of the country, which will take years, if not decades, learning from the experience that we know from Laos, to clear those cluster munitions. Ukraine had a few Soviet cluster munitions in its stocks that it used in 2022, but then it made the case that it needed to have cluster munitions to use. And so there have been cluster munitions delivered by missiles and by ballistic missiles, so launched from the ground rather than dropped from the air. A piece of news came through from Germany in the recent weeks, and I published a piece on it in an outlet called Responsible Statecraft. The documentary filmmakers managed to get confirmation, basically, that the United States has been pulling cluster munitions on its base in Germany, pulling them off the base, transferring them to Ukraine from there. And that raises all sorts of issues for the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which has 124 countries on board, of which 112 are states parties. As a state party, we would expect Germany to prohibit any transit or foreign stockpiling of cluster munitions, and that's what we interpreted its national legislation for the convention to do. But it also has a status of forces agreement with the United States, which it regards as allowing the US to do these activities. So these are some of the problems that the United States is creating for the Convention on Cluster Munitions while not being a member of the convention. The United States never participated in negotiating the Convention on Cluster Munitions back in 2007 and 2008. But we know from the WikiLeaks cables, the State Department cables that were leaked by WikiLeaks a couple of years later, that the United States did all it could behind the scenes to try and influence the treaty text and try and influence the countries who were negotiating it. I would say it had limited impact in that regard. There's an Article 21 about interoperability, about how states parties interact with countries who are not on board the convention. But it also has the very strict prohibition on any use, production, stockpiling, and trade of cluster munitions, and on any assistance with those prohibited activities. So these are issues that will be discussed at the annual meeting of the Treaty of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which will happen in Geneva at the United Nations next month, opening on the 10th of September. We don't expect the United States to be there because it doesn't participate even as an observer in the meetings of the convention. And that's another difference between the US on landmines and cluster munitions. In 2009, the Obama administration took the decision for the United States to begin participating as an observer in the mine ban treaty meetings. And I think the US has found that to be a useful experience. They were certainly quite terrified at the first meeting, but now realize that it is the framework for eliminating anti-personnel landmines, and it is the place to talk to all of the demining organizations, all of the countries who are affected by landmines, the ones who are providing victim assistance. It is the framework for providing for creating a mine-free world. We're not there yet on landmines. We're not there yet on cluster munitions, and we'd certainly like to see the United States be part of that solution by participating in those treaties. And there are things that the US could do on the way to participating in the treaties. I'd say on cluster munitions, start by coming to the Geneva meeting and seeing what it's all about. Maybe I'll just pause there because if Larry's back, we should probably go to him.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. That was really helpful and I think gave us a lot of really clear steps forward that the US can be taking. And to bookend, we will have Larry Schwab. Larry graduated from the West Virginia University School of Medicine in 1966 and was drafted during his medical internship to serve as a medical officer in Vietnam. Larry returned to Vietnam in the 90s to provide medical treatment and advice and became an active supporter of the international movement to ban landmines. He co-founded the West Virginia campaign to ban landmines and cluster bombs, as well as the student organization SALM, stands for Proud Students Against Landmines with Nora Sheets. And I will pass it over to Larry to talk a little bit about his experience.
Thank you, Ursula. And first of all, can you hear me? Am I live? Yeah, oh,
Sound great.
hooray. I've had multiple problems with this aging computer, and I'm sorry I was offline. The computer's been dodging out like that, and I apologize. So I'm pleased to be able to join this group and tell my side of a story, which has been a campaign ever since with Mary Wareham. I joined forces with the International Campaign in 1997 in Ottawa. For this occasion, I pulled out my Vietnam uniform. This is an original. It's a little frayed and worn, but this was the uniform worn by Vietnam War participants of the U.S. I wore this as I had two sets. This one is the one that survived the best, and I'm proud. I'm proud to wear it and to have served. And Nora Sheets is on the Zoom also. Together, we are the West Virginia campaign to ban landmines. Nora is an educator at St. Francis High School and primary school, and has contributed enormously to the campaign. As mentioned, I was conscripted. I was drafted as a soldier in 1967 upon completing part of my postgraduate medical education. Had some very serious reservations about honoring the draft, and finally consented to it as a non-combatant. My wife and I considered leaving the country actually and going to Canada, or simply resisting the draft and risk going to prison. I had two assignments. I was assigned initially to a surgical hospital, a small surgical hospital, where we started seeing landmine injuries and some horrible disfigurations, which altered the lives of dozens of young U.S. soldiers and even some civilians. I was then transferred to the 11th Field Artillery, and spent a very dangerous 6 months in field operations in 3 Corps, if you know where that is. There's around Saigon and in above the Delta. So I wanted to, Mary has outlined policy and details very articulately. I'm sorry I missed part of the early presentations in this, but I finally back online. I'm pleased. But I want to just tell you a story about a landmine survivor that I saw, one of the very first, and to tell you how complicated it is to identify the source of unexploded ordnance that's hidden in the ground and what it does to human beings. At the 7th Surgical Hospital attached to the unit where I was working, a soldier was choppered in who had encountered an in-ground landmine. He was an American soldier, as I remember. He was about 18 to 20 years of age, and he was brought in on a litter by helicopter. One leg had been destroyed. It was traumatic amputation below the right knee. I have photographs of this to document it. I think it's not appropriate to show them here in this forum, but the right knee was bandaged, and his foot was in a combat boot, and the boot had been tossed with the foot on the litter with this injured soldier. The other leg looked very badly damaged, and I couldn't tell because of his bloody uniform what his injury was. I started to examine him and realized the foot was very loose, and in a split second, I found myself holding that boot and his foot in my hand before me. It made an indelible impression on me that I've never forgotten, and I think about, and it's one of the motivations, that and dozens of other landmine and unexploded ordnance injuries that I witnessed, that got me so involved in the landmine campaign. The question was, and it's always been in my mind, because this was near our base camp, near Swan Lock in eastern Vietnam, who deployed that mine? It could have been ours for control of infiltrators of the Viet Cong regulars or the Viet Cong North Vietnam Army, or it could have been one of our mines that had been planted for security. It was never determined. And I mentioned this incident to just illustrate how random mines are, and they choose their victim. The footfall of a civilian, of a soldier, of a soldier from either army, likely to result in disaster. I think of that young soldier that lost both legs in a split second often, and I wonder where he is, and even if he is still living. But in one split, irrevocable second, he lost both legs and changed his life forever. So I very much appreciate being a part of this forum, and I'm very pleased to work with this campaign, which I think is essential in the cause of disarmament and humanity. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. And while not our original speaking order, I think it just brings us back from, the importance of things like attending meetings of the convention and meetings of the treaty to why we need to attend such events, and the importance of U.S. Changing its policy and coming more in line with the international treaties. Thank you so much, Larry. We're now going to go to questions. For the sake of our panelists, if folks can send messages either in the chat, or you can raise your electronic hand if you have a question, and I will call on you. In the meantime, while people get their thoughts together, I just wanted to go back to Lee. I know you recently were able to travel back to Laos with Legacies of War. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you saw today. I know you were talking about your experiences several decades ago, but what does that experience look like today?
Thank you, Isla, for that question. I'm very privileged to have the chance to travel back to Laos with Legacy of War, of course, and see what the environment there was like. And the picture that I used to have in my own mind, of course, when I left the country, I was only around, 9, 10 years old. And so that picture is no longer there. But what is surprising to me is after 50 years, that innocent farmers and children are still risking their life in doing what they do. Of course, the country of Laos, their main economic engine is its agriculture. And so therefore, parents and children are still risking their life out in the field every day. And so one of the opportunities that I had with Colonel Mike Burton is that with MAC in Siang Quang, was able to take us to experience a unexploded, ordnance, and allow us to detonate that bomb. And my God, it was a tremendous experience. Right after the bomb exploded, I couldn't help it but in tears, and just thinking to myself that, goodness, thank God that this worker was able to find one of these unexploded ordnance, and that we were able to detonate it without losing any life or further damaging human beings. And so that is one of the real life experience that I thought, oh gosh, in the past, I was just thinking, well, that was bad, but then experience it, personally, in person again, in that particular environment, it wasn't a beautiful feel. And who would know that such ordnance would be, laying there underground. And so that just becomes so real for me, of what the, people in Laos are still facing. The other point that I wanted to just share with you is that I think as a country, this unexploded material is also very risky, and it become a hurdle for business to invest, and corporate investor to even think about investing in that part of the world. And I thought, oh gosh, they needed the economic means beyond just day-to-day life. And so, if you really think about it, with today's impact of what, landmines and cluster munitions still do to that part of the world, it is still very, very, damaging, not only to the environment, but also to the business.
Thank you so much. And I think that ties really well to a question I've gotten in the chat. If any of the participants, and I do recognize a couple other members of the campaign on this call, so if someone outside of our panelists would like to answer this, or one of our panelists who are members of the campaign, if anyone has had experience with US demining assistance programs, can they just share how these funds are used and the impact it has on communities who suffer from UXO? So I know, Lee, you answered a little bit about sort of the impact that UXO has on these communities, but would anyone like to speak a little bit to the demining assistance programs? All right. While
That's like
people,
one, I can share what I've seen. I think one of the opportunities that we had also is that we met with all the colleagues in Laos who are dealing with victims, and the medical clinics that they actually deal with this, victims. We actually met with a couple of young, females that they've been handicapped by experiences this UXO accident, and darn it, it was heartbroken seeing these folks. But I tell you, this damage from this weapon to this human life, it's just beyond my own imagination, because even though they couldn't do what we normally do, but they still struggle to survive and live their life. And that just really, go beyond my own, feelings toward what kind of suffering do these people have to go through.
thank you so much. And I know Mike Burton, would you like to jump in briefly?
I think the audio.
Here we are.
Okay.
Legacies of War, which is a advocacy group that essentially advocates for the funding primarily of the demining effort in Southeast Asia. And the way that we do that is there is a line item in the State Department's budget for demining in Southeast Asia. This has been a long time coming. It started, Titus Peachy's online here, and he can talk about how that got started with Fred Manhoff and people with the stories. But in the current budget, there is about $75 million in the line item for the State Department budget. Now, the way that works is once that gets approved by Congress, then the State Department will put out feelers actually to the demining organizations such as HALO and MAG and all the rest of them to make a bid on doing demining in specific areas. In turn, because the U.S. does not give money directly to the Laotian government, it all goes through these nonprofits. And there's a question there. Lee and I have talked about the status of Laos and the tax status, so on and so on. But that's another issue. But what then happens is these organizations, these NGOs, go out to the NRA, the Lao, not that NRA, but the other NRA, to the Lao government organizations, and they have to approve where those demining areas and process will be. So there's about a 1 year cycle in there to get all of this done and approved. And we have to abide by in our case, with the Laotian government, and we have to respect it's their country after all. We screwed it up, but it's theirs. But they're happy, I think, to have us do that. But it is something that they want to approve. So there's a process that takes place before somebody actually gets boots on the ground to go in and demine these. And I just sent a chat in about how long it takes to defuse a single bomb. Lee mentioned that we were there, arranged to have us, I think it was with MAG, demonstrate one of those. It took, and this is on a flat land area, by the way, which is the easiest place to get rid of these things. If you're on a hill or in the jungle, it's a different story, but it took about an hour to find the bomb, identify what it was, put a fuse onto it, run a wire out 1,000 yards, notify everybody in the area. And what was amazing to me about that was how casual the local folks were. There's people farming, they were out there doing things, and they're so used to this that they just keep doing it. They just keep on doing whatever they're doing and leaving the deminers to do their thing, and then we set it off after trying to clear the area. And one that I was on, there was right at a fence, there was a house being built. The Laotian government now trying to replace most of the wooden buildings that are there with ones made out of bricks and cement cinder block, and it looked like it was about half finished. And I asked the Lao that was with me what was happening there, and he said, well, they found the land and they started to dig the basement under these, and then they found there were 70 or so pieces of metal in there. They didn't know what it was. They stopped until they clear all that. So this bogs down, not only dangerous and killing people and maiming people, but it slows down the economy. The economic impact of this on particularly Laos is so profound because 25% of the country at least can't be used because of these bombs, or have to be very cautiously done. So the government, again, there, in applying the funds that they get, or that are through this for the NGOs to do this, has to be part of an economic application as well. Where does Lao want to put its effort to try to clear the bombs? And there are areas that they've just simply written off. They're so heavily bombed. So it's a laborious political process. I had started into this, well, I was part of the problem back in 1966 and 67. So, but when I undertook trying to do something about this, my first thought was, why doesn't Laos sue the United States government for reparations in the World Court? After all, well, I pursued that for about 2 years until I discovered how impossible that is. First of all, the United States has not once ever to admit that it violated international treaties, which it did in the 1962 Accords, clearly, but that doesn't matter. We don't want to do that. So now we're coming in behind the matter and trying to find some way to rectify, at least some members, what we can do is clearing up the bombs. But the economic impact, the human impact are profound. And, I think one of the things I was curious to hear here was, what can we do further? Bring some pressure and, I don't know, embarrassment to the United States for not being a member of the treaty. And I was interested in what was said earlier about the fact that the ambassador of the U.S., what was it, back a few years ago, said this had never happened. Well, we had to take that statement and put it up in neon lights on Times Square and see if it has any impact. The other part of this is it is the secret war in this case, not talking about Vietnam necessarily or Cambodia, but in Laos, It was never admitted by the US that we were at war there. And I find every time I go out and give a talk, first of all, I have to remind people where Laos is located, and that it was part of the war. And secondly, that this war was going on there, because a lot of Americans just don't understand that.
Thanks. Sorry.
Further use, I'm sorry, just one last thing and I'll shut up. But
yeah, we just have a lot of questions, so thank you.
The continued use of these kinds of munitions in places like Ukraine. These are and cluster bombs are basically airborne landmines. They're not intended to explode right away. They're intended to bury themselves in the ground, and then they get in there, and then people step on them later, or children play with them as toys. And that's part of the reason the Ukraine urged them not to do them, but there they are.
Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing your experience, Mike. We really appreciate it. We have gotten a wonderful flood of questions in the chat. Thank you all. I have one quick question and then maybe a little bit more complicated one. The quick question goes to Larry and Nora, as you happen to be on the call. Are there more chapters of Psalm in the US, in US high schools? And would you be open if someone wanted to reach out to ask you about that effort? And then for Mary, why haven't more signatories to the Convention on Cluster Munitions been outspoken about Lithuania's move to leave the treaty and the transit of cluster munitions through Germany? So I'll go to Larry for the quick question and then to Mary for the more complicated one. We can go to Mary first.
Okay, sure thing. Lithuania hasn't left the Convention on Cluster Munitions yet. The Parliament went through a process in July to approve a legislative measure to withdraw, and the President signed it into law at the end of July. Now Lithuania has to inform states parties of its decision. It's going to do that apparently next month in Geneva at the annual meeting. It also has to inform the United Nations, and then it has to wait for 6 months, because this is a key provision of the convention, because and then the withdrawal will occur if all of that happens. It's not possible to withdraw from the Convention on Cluster Munitions in times of war. Same thing goes for the Mine Ban Treaty. The whole point of international humanitarian law is that it applies at all times, peace and war. And so that's kind of another factor in what's happened with Lithuania. We saw strong statements from the International Committee of the Red Cross, who's extremely upset with Lithuania's decision, because it's the first country not just to withdraw from any of the 5 major conventions, humanitarian disarmament conventions, we call them, that prohibit an entire class of weapons, so chemical weapons, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, cluster munitions, landmines. There's one more I'm forgetting right now, but it does set, it's a terrible, terrible example. And there has been a year-long effort behind the scenes to engage with Lithuania's government on this concern, but they decided to push through with it. We also heard that the United States met with Lithuania before they went ahead with this decision. So I'd be really curious to know what the United States was saying to Lithuania in that meeting, and if it played a role. Perhaps we need some more WikiLeaks cables on this one. And we'll see what happens in Geneva when the countries come together, but we're expecting more countries to be expressing concern and regret at Lithuania's decision, and urging Lithuania to reconsider. It does not have to go down this path, but it has certainly chosen it. So we'll see how we go on that. And on Germany, there's been some attention But there's also been a bit of a shrug. I think people knew that the United States had cluster munitions on bases, not just in Germany, on its US military base in Germany, but potentially in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Spain. We know that the United States pulled its cluster munitions off its bases in Norway and in the United Kingdom right after the Convention on Cluster Munitions was adopted. And we believe that was because the governments of Norway and the UK said, right, get them off. These are now prohibited weapons and we do not want them on our territory and under, so they did that. But it apparently was, the Germany knew that the US had these artillery fired cluster munitions on its base in Germany, and now we know from the documentary filmmaker that it has been transferring them from Germany, apparently on trains through Germany, through Poland, and then on to Ukraine. Thanks.
Thank you. And Larry, do you know if there are any other Psalm branches and if you'd be willing to be connected with someone interested?
We know of two others, and Nora, you might know of others too, but there's one in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, that we were aware of. There's no direct connection with the Psalm here with Nora Sheets. The Psalm, by the way, is Proud Students Against Landmines. It's Nora Sheets' program at St. Francis School in Morgantown, West Virginia. Then there was mention of a group in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I saw a note online that there were some university level students who were interested in the landmine campaign. I was in attempted communication with them. I didn't have a phone number, but wrote an email, but have not had an answer. So there might be two, at least one active and maybe another extant that are possible. Nora, do you have other information? You might be muted, Nora.
There you go.
Yeah.
One thing I can say is our school, because it had only gone up to 8th grade, once our students were out, they went out to other school systems. But as they aged, one of the things they did was stay in contact, and I would stay in contact with them virtually through computer communications and our website, and try to keep them up on what's going on. So for example, when the Lithuania situation came up, I reached out and said, hey, we've got a lot of parliamentarians that need to be contacted about this issue. And one thing about the students, even as they age, at one point I was the teacher, but now they're the teachers. They actually go out to their school systems, and it might not be a formal organization because they have to find sponsors, and sometimes that's a little difficult. But I told the students, I said, you be the leader and you run with it and see what you can do, even if it's just a few friends. So one of the things I find that there are leaders in schools that want to be a part of peacemaking, and this is a great way for them to do it and have a significant impact in many cases, even if it's just getting the word out. And I've always found that one thing about students is not a lot of people will listen to me, but they'll listen to a younger person express why they think this is so important. So even with the Lithuania situation, they immediately recognized that that was going to be something that was going to have to be addressed and was very, very important to jump on. So I reach out to any organization that, if you know somebody, I know through some organizations like Marshall Legacy, because they're raising money for mine detection dogs, sometimes they'll contact us and say, how can we get more involved in the other part of this issue? So I'm certainly willing and able to instruct, help, or anything else we can do to bring in more youth groups, because I've always felt that the younger generation is the one that's going to be, leading the way for us.
Thank you so much, Nora. And it's a little scary to think that the younger generation wasn't even born when some of these treaties were signed. But it just shows it's normal for them. Why wouldn't there be a treaty to ban landmines? It's always existed for them. So I did see Jeff, you had your hand up, Jeff Abramson, if you wanted to ask a question, and then we'll wrap up. Jeff, I think you're on mute. Okay. Given we...
You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry about that. My headphones sometimes don't actually pick up me speaking. It's kind of, thanks for having this meeting. It's sort of a two-part, somewhat quick question. One is, the main frame of my question is, how can we think about this in a bipartisan way? And I think maybe Ursula, you might want to jump in, because you were tracking so many of the resolutions and the Republican and Democratic support on cluster munitions. You know, when the Obama administration started, Senator Leahy had sort of organized a letter that got a bipartisan number of more than 2/3 of senators saying they were ready to move forward on the mine ban treaty. We've had moments of bipartisanship, and I think at the moment we could probably still do that. So I guess it's a question of how did the panelists sort of think about making sure this issue is seen not as a partisan issue, but a bipartisan one, and also how to talk about how out of step the United States is with its allies, with others. I think can be a bipartisan approach as well. So just sort of wanted to know what people thought or advice on making this not a partisan but a bipartisan issue. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And I will take moderator prerogative to jump in and start to answer that question. I think what's been really amazing to see over the last several years in Congress is a steady bipartisan effort to address some of these issues. We've seen several letters to the Biden administration from members of the House, and Senate, especially related to the cluster munition transfers to Ukraine. And then we've seen over the last 2 years, year and a half, at least half a dozen amendments get voted on the House floor related to cluster munitions transfers. And while transfer is not the only issue of concern, you know, it is an entryway for many members of Congress to start thinking about these issues, especially as we see 5, 6 transfers of cluster munitions to Ukraine make the news. So at the end of last year, we actually had 214 members of the House vote in favor of at least one amendment to ban the transfer of cluster munitions, of which there were 114 Republicans and 100 Democrats. You don't see that kind of bipartisanship in the 118th Congress, and yet we're seeing it on this issue. We've seen 2 more votes happen this year in the House, both with strong bipartisan support once again. And while we haven't been able to get all 214 members to agree on the same amendment and all show up on the same day to vote for it, the fact that we are seeing this momentum and the fact that we are seeing this as a bipartisan concern is so important. We don't want this to become a partisan issue. We don't think this is a partisan issue. This is an issue of human safety. This is an issue of joining the international consensus, of our leadership in the space, of not eroding these important norms. So it is exciting. The Senate has been a lot quieter on the issue. You know, especially since Senator Leahy retired, you know, there's been less movement on the Senate side. Most of the effort has been on the House side. And while we really do appreciate the senators that have spoken up on these issues, you know, we'd like to see them a little more forward-leaning, a little bit more engaged, really take that leadership that Senator Leahy showed and run with it. And he left such an important legacy we'd hate to see it squandered. So I'll let, I don't know, Mary, if there's anything you would like to add on this. Otherwise, I think we can close. Go ahead, Mary. Sorry, you're muted.
Oh God, everybody on this call is muted. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for the link that you put in the chat there, Ursula, to your roundup of the congressional activity. That's the most activity we've seen on cluster munitions in years in the Congress. This was completely ignored when the convention was adopted in 2008, with the exception of a few champions. But something kind of pricked the conscience there. And I just say that for us, you know, for me, the champions on these issues are the affected countries who've taken ownership of this problem, of the problems that are caused by landmines and cluster munitions, and are doing all they can to clear. And yes, the United States is helping them, but I just wish that the United States would listen to, you know, the Lao Foreign Minister Salam Said Komisif, who negotiated the Convention on Cluster Munitions, Lebanon, Iraq, Cambodia. These are the countries who fully understand the impact of landmines and of cluster munitions, and have joined, for the most part, the relevant treaties on this. Other countries seem to take precedence, of course, in the strategic world that we are in. But it is the affected countries who've led the way on the treaties and on the clearance and on the victim assistance. So please, let's listen to them. And it's good that we started this call that way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I did just also want to give Senator Merkley has done quite a bit to take up the mantle from Senator Leahy, and we just urge all members of the Senate to continue that push, continue that fight. With that, I'd really like to thank all of our attendees today for taking an hour out of your morning to think about these issues, to talk about these issues. I'd like to really thank especially Larry and Lee for sharing their personal stories. I know it's not an easy thing to rehash, especially on a Thursday morning. And Mary, for all of your very thoughtful comments. I'm going to pass it to Anna to close us out, and thank you all.
Yes, and thank you all of you for tuning in to our event. Please help us amplify our message by sharing this talk with your congressional offices, friends, and colleagues. The cluster munitions and other explosives have enduring legacies on the land and its people. And in just a few weeks, the world will be gathering for the Convention of Cluster Munition in Geneva and the 5th Review Conference of the Mine Ban Treaty that will be taking place in November in Siem Reap, Cambodia. So for staffers here, we really hope that you guys will go back to your offices and talk to your congressional members about joining this treaty and supporting this issue. And I will also share links to go follow us on our Twitter and check out our website. And have a good day, everybody. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you all so much.